Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. I am your host, Mike Leon. Ben here is the founder of FDA Imports and a former FDA regulatory counsel who is now helping companies around the world navigate the complex intersection of FDA oversight, customs enforcement, and international trade. And in today's episode, we're talking about how the FDA's increasingly data-driven import systems, including its predict risk scoring technology, are transforming how shipments are screened and prioritized for inspection. It's been good to see you as always. I said the word predict there, but it's actually an acronym. So I would love for you, A, to explain the acronym, how the system actually works, and where does it fit in the process when a shipment actually hits the U.S. Customs?
Good to see you, Mike. I think that it's best to start with what would it look like if you don't have a system like Predict first. All right, let's do that. So when cargo comes to the United States, someone has to tell the government that it's here, and that's the customs broker who's been hired by the importer. And it used to be years ago that you would go to the customs house with a bunch of paper, and you would have your entry, which is written out, and you'd have your customs invoice, you'd have your bill of lading, or your airway bill, or your whatever documents for shipping, your packing list, describing, and you would give it to a customs officer who then would look at it, and they would try to make a determination as to whether or not it should be examined or not. And of course, that was back in the day when there were not billions and billions of shipments and separate entries come into the country, daily, if largely, like just lots and lots of them all the time. So the data is now managed by systems, electronic systems. However, most of the data that was required and has been required for electronic screening is basically just the electrification of the same data that was being used years and years ago. That is just an electronic invoice. It's an electronic entry. It's electronic airway bill or bill of lading, but it's the same information. And so the advantage you have first is the ability to review that much more quickly because you have a computer. The second thing, though, that needed to happen was that getting better data, right? Like actually getting data that's relevant. Like if you were going to use an invoice as part of your evaluation for whether you should inspect imported food, that would be like going down to the grocery store and buying a bunch of food and then showing the receipt to your friend and say, which one should I inspect for safety, right? You can't use the sheet for that, right? All you're going to do is basically say, well, it seems like the ready-to-eat food might be riskier, right? Which is how the government sort of thinks about those kinds of things. What happened, of course, then was the need to have systems that thought more creatively with respect to the data, which is what Predict is. Predict is an acronym. It stands for Predictive Risk-Based Evaluation for Dynamic Import Compliance Targeting. And that's a very long acronym in order to come up with a great word that describes what it does. The system predicts risk in the supply chain by using not only the data that ordinarily comes in with an entry, but also other data that's available to it either publicly, like if there's some sort of an event that occurs somewhere in the world, then it might increase the risk of shipments coming from that place in the world, or information that's in the supply chain. There's people in the supply chain that don't make a lot of sense. And like, why are these people in it? And that might sort of raise the flag. And so what Predict is doing is scoring individual imported shipments based upon risk. And the risk can be inherent to the product. It's seafood instead of, like milled rice. Right? Dry milled rice is going to be relatively low risk, except maybe for pesticides, maybe mold. But fresh seafood is going to have other kinds of risks, to include microbiological risks. And if it's aquaculture, then maybe vet drugs could be in the flesh of the fish. And so the system has inherent, it can evaluate inherent risk as to what the product is, but also supply chain risk and region and origin risk, plus historical data, right? If the FDA's had a problem with a supplier in the past, the system's able to sort of pick that up and maybe it ratchets up the score with respect to risk, and then it gets to the point where basically it makes a recommendation to inspect cargo. So it's a lot of words, but it's actually a sort of a summary of what that system is designed to do.
And I'm hearing that they're making tweaks to this system in terms of adding machine learning, other analytic tools. Can you talk a little bit about these and the incorporation of AI and these artificial intelligence systems? Are they true AI systems, or are they more like advanced pattern recognition engine?
Good question. Predict itself is based on evolutionary algorithms, an AI, of course, is based upon is algorithmic with respect to its processes, plus also in the actual processing itself, it more and more is acting as a network, and as opposed to sort of just a mathematical calculation. So predict would be like very early AI. It's more than faster human thinking. That's the way I like to say it. Like if you think about like the computer systems, Chinook was one that was very popular, and it was the one there was a system that played checkers, and you could play checkers against Chinook, and if you could beat it, you were pretty good. Chinook wasn't really artificial intelligence; it just was really, really fast human intelligence, and it could think about way more end games than you could. And Big Blue, which was a chess computer, was the same kind of thing. This is a little different. This is the computer learning by using evolutionary algorithms, where the algorithm takes the feedback of its prior decisions, and then it begins to adjust based upon the outcomes of prior decisions. The system thinks that this kind of pattern recognition is going to produce a positive result for salmonella, which of course I use the word positive, which is a negative outcome. It's a bad thing. But it's a feedback that can go back into the system, and then the system sort of learns from that and realizes to look for that. But then it starts to adjust and make recommendations, and starts to come up with. And so gradually, it sort of evolves with respect to its thinking and its. Now the newer technology is just light years ahead of that, and Customs is using that far more than the FDA. So FDA is benefiting from the fact that Customs, which is receiving all of the data that the FDA gets at the entry, is running their AI systems, on the data as it comes in, and then spitting the FDA data out, which is then running it through Predict. So it's almost like getting double treatment.
It's a good explainer on like how these algorithms tend to, raise red flags, the information that's coming into it. But I did want to ask you, have you seen the FDA's newer analytics? Have you seen signs that these newer analytics are leading to faster detentions or different enforcement priorities compared with years ago?
Yes. And the results were actually pretty quick. I happen to help write the original statement of work for Predict. The acronym for Predict was one of many options. There were everybody likes acronyms in the government, and we had a bunch of different ideas of what we're going to call this thing. And it was created actually at Fido's, which is a Irish pub in DC down in Chinatown. And a bunch of us were over there, and we eventually came up with Predict, and that's what Predict, the name was. And when it first was used, it was running alongside of the FDA's existing screening system. So all of the same data was going into both systems, and Predict would make a recommendation, and the other system would make a recommendation, and sometimes that recommendation would be different. And the old system would release it, the shipment, and Predict would say examine it, and so then the agency would make a determination whether or not to rescind the release from the old system and go ahead and do an examination, and the hit rate was substantially higher. With Predict, like it was far more than just statistically significant. There were many cases where Predict made a recommendation to do an examination, and the inspectors sampled, tested, and found it to be a problem, whereas the old system just had already released it; it was letting it go, and that was 2003, 2004, right? So we're now 2026. We're more than 20 years later. And the answer is that they've struggled with keeping the funding up in order to keep it going, which is not new, right? The government, gets a new toy, and then they forget how to maintain it, or it costs money to maintain it, and they're looking for budget cuts, and it gets cut, and eventually it comes back. And but now, over the last several years, because everybody realizes that it's not going back in the bottle. that the agencies are looking more seriously at how to reinforce, predict with other AI enhanced systems. So with even 20 years ago, the results were actually remarkable. I wasn't in the agency at the time, but I knew a lot of people in the agency, and so I was aware of it, what was going on. I'd already left the FDA, but so yeah, without questions, the hit rate is substantially higher.
Ben, I would love for you to talk a little bit about how important this data consistency is for the importers. All these things, registration numbers, product codes, all these supplier names, when these algorithms are evaluating every line entry, how important is that data consistency for the importer?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. Data is there's data in everything, right? I mean, FDA requires registrations for foreign facilities and virtually everything they regulate. And those facilities then have numbers, and those numbers are related to a very specific site-specific facility that's located in a particular place. And it used to be that there was no way to validate that. And so now they've got other systems in place to sort of validate that the address is actually real, right? That a drug manufacturer address isn't the flat in some apartment building in Paris, France, right? Whereas before you wouldn't be able to tell that. And so data has gotten better and richer. But the actual registration number itself unchanged. It's the data around that's helping to create robustness in the registration system, as an example. So when you get something wrong, right? When you put the wrong number in, you miss it by a digit, the system's going to spit it out. Because these systems obviously can go back and check their legacy data and determine whether or not this makes sense in relation to the supply chain of the products coming in and the company that's being declared, or the region from which it's coming, or the shipping line that's being used historically as opposed to now. Like it can evaluate all those data points. And you put in the registration number, and the system can recognize an anomaly, and then it does a ranking to determine whether or not it's something that matters or not, and then it makes recommendations. So getting those things right matter. And at the entry level, when you're bringing in product and make a declaration to the government, it's just information. It's names of companies, it's names of products, it's the harmonized tariff schedule, the code, the HTS code the customs relies on for determining what the duty is. Now, once you start attaching duty to these things, and we're in an environment where we've been talking about tariffs for, in this setting for quite some time, and that's still going on. That's money, right? And so when the government thinks it's due money, it increases the risk that if there's a mistake, the government notices it. The HTS classification is wrong. The country of origin is wrong. The country from which it came is not actually the country of origin. It's just a transshipment company, a country. So getting these things right are critical, and the systems are smarter. I know a lot of people that will say, look, if I'm on an import alert, I'm just going to change my company name and open up next door or use my brother's company. The system's smarter than that. I mean, the system can figure that out, and will figure that out. And so, getting the data correct, all these different little data elements you listed through quite a number of them are all relevant, and not getting them right is going to result in significantly more examinations.
So with this push towards automation, how are the agencies talking to each other with respect to FDA, CBP? Are they sharing more data in real time than they used to? Talk a little bit about the coordination between them.
Yeah, FDA and Customs have always been pretty integrated. USDA hadn't been for quite some time. After 9/11, one of the things that happened, one of the changes that occurred, was that the USDA inspectors that were at the border used to work for USDA. They were brought into Homeland Security. So they stopped wearing USDA uniforms, and they started wearing the customs uniform. Now, a bunch of the old timers didn't like that. So they actually had a brain drain. A lot of people left. They didn't like working for customs. But the result is, now that has worked its way out, the result is that you have USDA inspections that are happening by customs ag inspectors in the facility. Now, that's not data, right? However, those inspectors and the targeting of all of their activity is data-driven. Now, for USDA and Customs, it's easier because they're actually there, right? They're customs employees doing the ag inspection. For the FDA relies on electronic data transmissions from customs. So when you import something that's regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, there are a number of codes that is going to help dictate the direction that data is going to go. And if it's FDA regulated, Customs is going to take all of the data and it's going to peel off the FDA data and it's going to send your FDA data off to the FDA. But Customs is going to do a screening on that for its own risk-related issues, right? Which is ordinarily not going to be FDA related, right? They're going to let FDA screening operate FDA risk. But they're still going to do some screening and they can find anomalies that might very well impact an FDA issue as well. So yes, because the data is all coming through Customs now, all agencies, whether it's Consumer Product Safety Commission, it's the EPA, it's USDA, it's the FDA, anybody got their DEA, anybody got their hands on products or services that are regulated and are crossing the border are much more integrated because the data is so integrated. And it's coming from the same source, the customs broker. It's all coming through the same pipeline. So they have the ability to screen it, evaluate it, compare it, split it up, and pass it to the agencies that need it.
Ben, we talked about the government and how they have so much data in the systems. What about these small importers that they don't have the full-scale compliance software? What practical steps can they take to make sure that their filings don't trigger these unnecessary holds at the border?
Wow, that's a really good question. The purpose of the screening is for the agency to determine whether or not they should examine something, primarily for regulatory purposes. Right? It's not really an investigative tool for things like crime, right? Fraud. Although Customs does examine for fraud, they'll do their examinations for fraud in the data. But the data, the requirements for production of the data is not to capture fraud. It's to ensure that that safety is maintained with the product. Well, all the safety issues, it's just really the electrification and of course then now the thinking with AI, but it's really the data is coming from the supply chain to include the manufacturers, to include what the product is, which would also include some affirmations of compliance. You mentioned drug registrations, listings, product coding, stuff like that. All of those are all arising out of the regulatory requirements of the product itself. Those are things that the importer really needs to know, that it would be great if they could have more data to evaluate that, but they really should be evaluating that anyway substantively, like actually engaging with the foreign supplier, knowing who they're dealing with and what they're getting. So they still can protect themselves, but it's going to be a more traditional way. It's not going to be by relying on data.
Ben, as we wrap here and you're looking ahead, do you expect technology to keep expanding the FDA's reach at the ports, or will there always going to be a human element in deciding which shipments get stopped? Excuse me.
Yeah, I think there's going to continue to be a human element for this for quite some time. I don't know if that's forever. I mean, we've all watched, sci-fi movies that 150 years out, right? Let's just set that aside. Let's just think in terms of say the next 10, 15 years, even 20 years. My gut is that that until the systems start exercising judgment, then that's really what inspectors are doing, right? All the system is doing right now is recommending shipments for exam. And that is a judgment call, but it can be quantified, right? These risks can be quantified, and arguably so can judgment, but not yet, right? It's still humans that exercise judgment based upon history and experience of being in the trade and being in the practice and seeing things happen, and what to look for. So I think we have to say that yes, any inspection function arguably could be replaced by AI or by a robot system, but I do think it's going to be some time.
Right. Let's hope it's sometime. Ben, thank you. Ben, thank you as always for the time and insights. Truly appreciate it.
Yep. Good to see you.
And thank you to everybody out there for joining us on this installment of FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance. Look, if your business is navigating the FDA or customs review water, or you want to know how new data screening systems could affect your shipments, do me a favor, visit FDAImports.com right now to connect with Ben and the team. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review or comment, or share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. As always, I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.